Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 is utterly riddled with mystery. Whether that is the motivations of the characters, the way the overall narrative is playing out, or whether it's the characters themselves, there is just so much to delve into in regards to its ideas, its themes, its storytelling, and its origins. And three of the mysteries that are central to this story are the core antagonists, the Sith Triumvirate, Darth Traya, Darth Sion, and Darth NIhilus. Now, if you are unaware, one of the core themes of Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 is consequences. Almost everything in this game revolves around the consequences that stemmed from things that have happened in Knights of the Old Republic 1 and the stories just before that. And these consequences are core to our villains being the way they are. A good example of this is Darth Traya. She, as a villain, is a direct consequence of the Jedi Order's hubris and dogma. She only exists as a consequence of their inability to see beyond their code. She only exists because of their actions in regard to her teachings and the way they exiled her for simply having a different view. Darth Sion, as well, is a consequence of war. He is born of the violence and the hatred sparked from Exile and Darth Revan, and truthfully there's a lot of theories as to who Darth Sion is, but that might be for a future video. Because of course, in this video we are focusing on Darth NIhilus. He is the legitimate consequence of wounding the Force. All living things binded and connected together. What happens when you damage that? What happens when you cause so much suffering within the Force itself? Well, he is the consequence, a living embodiment of death, the antithesis to the Force, a wound in the Force that lives to consume and destroy it. But unlike Darth Traya and to some extent Darth Sion, Darth NIhilus' origin is shrouded in mystery. Who was Darth NIhilus before he became the wound in the Force and the Sith Lord that we know and love? So fortunately, we do have a very clear example of a wound in the Force in the Jedi Exile that is vastly more expanded upon. We know how she became a wound, we know who she was before she became a wound, and these two characters in Darth NIhilus and the Jedi Exile are purposefully twisted mirrors to each other. We know this because of Chris Avellone, the lead writer, and a vast majority of elements within the story. They were born of the same chaos, the same destruction, the same terrible event that split the Force apart. But as human beings, they learned to deal with it totally differently. Now, explicitly within the lore of Knights of the Old Republic, we don't know anything about Darth NIhilus' past before he literally became the Sith Lord. However, we do know how he became Darth NIhilus to an extent, and as somebody who has studied these games extensively, I want to give you the most likely reality of how he got from who he was to Darth NIhilus. The most important piece of this puzzle is actually the Jedi Exile. Most of what we can learn about Darth NIhilus is based on his twisted mirror. And what is she? A Jedi who has a unique ability to connect with other living beings through the Force, which allows her to form absurdly powerful Force bonds, and then has those bonds stripped away from her in an instant. And because of how unique this is within Star Wars itself, it kind of makes sense to apply that to Darth NIhilus as a character too. We know that the Jedi Exile and NIhilus were both born of Malachor 5. These two characters are the consequences of using the mass shadow generator to cripple an entire army and an entire world. And with that knowledge, we have to assume that Darth NIhilus was present at the final battle of Malachor 5. We also have to assume that Darth NIhilus had a unique ability in the Force, much like the Jedi Exile. He must have had a way of bonding with those around him, and there is an excerpt from the campaign guide which doesn't outright say this, but it insinuates it subtly. because it says that much like everybody in the Mandalorian Wars, by its conclusion at the Battle of Malachor, the man who had become Darth NIhilus lost everything and everyone he loved, and that the pain and the suffering that he was feeling because of this was actually consuming him. And on top of that, he was being made severely ill by the mass shadows of Malachor 5, which is further corroborated by the Old Republic MMO. Now, if he's being made ill by mass shadows, that means he has to be surrounded by them. And you can only be surrounded by mass shadows once the devastation has occurred, which actually suggests that he was on the surface of Malachor 5 after it was crippled by the mass shadow generator. The campaign guide then says that he began to consume the life force of the survivors around him. But initially he didn't know this was happening, and he unknowingly killed another survivor, consuming their force essence and totally numbing him of his suffering. His illness then began to fade, as did the memories of his past and the memories of the bonds he had created, and this relief was so pleasurable that he began to embrace this wound within and began to consume more and more, becoming totally numb to his suffering and his misery. Knights of the Old Republic 2 also suggests in the description of his mask that he was a beast who died and was then reborn on Malachor, which to me, with all of this information, essentially confirms that he was present on Malachor 5 after the mass shadow generator was activated. He then consumes all of the survivors and is then found by Darth Traya. Now this also lines up because where is Traya sometime after the Mandalorian Wars? She's on Malachor 5. She follows Revan's footsteps and discovers the Trayus Academy, and she falls to the dark side. And it's very possible that she begins studying wounds in the Force because she finds this survivor on Malachor 5, and she then takes him to the Trayus Academy, and using the knowledge within teaches him about his power and the dark side, and then christens him Darth NIhilus. And so with all of this information, if we circle back to the original question of the video, who was Darth NIhilus before Knights of the Old Republic 2, I genuinely believe the answer is this. He was a Jedi Revanchist who went against the Jedi Order and followed Revan to the Mandalorian Wars. We know that he had to have been a Jedi because of his unique ability to bond with people through the Force like the Jedi Exile. The Jedi Exile and Darth NIhilus are the only two characters in Star Wars who become living embodiments of a wound in the Force. And because it is such a unique thing, it can only be assumed that they were born from the exact same experience, and so they would need to be within the same kind of circumstances for it to happen to both of them. And additionally, he must have been some kind of Force user because he knew how to consume the Force from another living being. And if he was, let's say, just a generic soldier or somebody who wasn't aware of his Force capabilities, he wouldn't have known how to do that in that moment to consume the Force, so we can only assume that he was trained in the Force in some way, which again gives more fuel to the fire that he was a Jedi. A Jedi who was traumatized by the bonds he had created through the Force, and unlike the Jedi Exile, he became consumed by that instead of cutting it off. Now, to some of you, this conclusion might have been pretty obvious, but I've actually had arguments with even Star Wars YouTubers in the past about Darth NIhilus who tried to say that he was a Sith before KOTOR 2, which is genuinely impossible based on everything I've told you today. So I just wanted to make this video to put all of this information together to give you what I believe is the actual picture of who this character was before he became the character we know. If you have a different perspective to these events and came to a different conclusion, please do let me know down in the comment section below. I would love to read your thoughts. Perhaps consider subscribing to join the biggest growing Knights of the Old Republic community on YouTube, and if you liked this video, you should check out this video. It goes into detail about why Darth NIhilus was the perfect villain for KOTOR 2. I'll see you there.